Hicks will be talking about James Hoban Jr.'s Gems of Irish Eloquence, Wit, and Anecdote from 1841. Maureen Smith will be talking about John Patrick Prendergast's The Cromwellian Settlement from 1868. And Adam Tenhouse will speak on a digest of the published opinions of the Attorneys General from 1877.
So I will attempt to be brief but detailed. My section of the catalog was designated literature, but it contained a broad array of literature. Included precepts, grammar, which the majority of those were French language learning books and keys to them. So I had the same problem that Ruby had in finding the keys and even finding the books themselves. They didn't exist here anymore. Literature also included oratory, which most were non-English language, but the ones that were memorial addresses, and memorial addresses to Americans and then English speakers. Also, it was the foundation of the liberal arts education for the Jesuits. There was Cicero, Ciceronis, Demosthenes, lots and lots of Greek and Latin. So I avoided that section when choosing my book. I'm not a fan of Greek nor Latin. And then the other section that really I think represented the Jesuits' liberal arts education was the poetry section, which was again lots and lots of Greek and Latin, and then translations from the Greek and Latin poetry into English, and I believe there was some translation into French as well. But the book that I decided to choose was Gems of Irish Eloquence, Wit, and Anecdote, because when I first came, it was one of the first 25 titles that I came across, and it just always stuck out in my mind, because none of the other books, except for one other one, mentioned the word Irish in it, besides the publication imprint location as Dublin. It just didn't occur anywhere else in this section for a university or for a college that was located in an extremely Irish American neighborhood. So I decided to do a little bit of research on it, of course. It was published by the same publisher as NEOMS, which I found interesting when you said that it was an extremely Catholic prevalent publishing company, since when I was looking through this, and I probably have not done as thorough of a job as I could have, there are no religious references to it. This is an Irish book. It was published in 1841, so I believe it was prior to their name changing to, was it J. Murphy Publishing Company? It's titled under here as John Murphy, printer and publisher. So as I said before, it's a very Irish identity book, and although the title says Gems of Irish Eloquency, Wit, and Anecdote, I believe that the compiler, James Hoban Jr., was probably the wittiest and feistiest Irish in this book. In his preface, he says, let me get this straight. All right. It has been well remarked that although the school of Irish eloquence is plainly different from every other, that each master in that school is just as clearly distinguishable from the rest. Each indeed is captivating, each peculiar in his manner and energy of pathos. And also, in the introduction, this is not brief and concise as I wished it would have been. I thought I had taken this quote out. So, this is certainly my favorite one. It is, quote, "The character of the Irish people to an observing mind presents peculiar ingredients of interest. The character has imprinted itself upon the destiny and history of many of the modern nations." I think that profoundly reflects the Irish character of the 19th century, trying to establish themselves as American. They have fought their own revolution, they fought against the Irish, the Americans have fought against the Irish, they have the same character as the people that they're surrounding themselves with at this point. And interesting enough, James Hoban Jr. was the son of an Irish immigrant, James Hoban Sr., who became the architect of the first White House and then a collaborator and architect of the rebuild of the White House. Two of James Hoban Sr.'s sons went to joined the United States Navy, and one, Henry, became a Jesuit. James Hoban Jr. himself became a well-respected orator and the district attorney of the District of Columbia. Unfortunately, their papers, the Hoban's family's papers, have been destroyed, that were lost in a fire. So once again, there's a source that we've lost. And so there's not much more that someone can learn about him. But I find it interesting the way that he divided his book. He divided it into two sections, Eloquence and then Wit and Anecdote. And I did research on the men that he included in the Eloquence and in the second section. And he decided what it appears to be to divide the men that he referenced by their occupation. The first half under Eloquence, all the men are lawyers, politicians, or judges in Ireland. The second half are playwrights, poets, and revolutionaries, publishing revolutionary works. But they all are Irish men, part of the Irish National Party. I have my assumptions on why the Jesuits would include this in their library. In my mind, it is because it would have attracted literate Irish American readers to it. It would have given them a successful Irish American author to look up to, and also it would have reinforced their American identity in Chicago at the time.
My segment was history, so it was modern history, history of the U.S., Great Britain, France, other countries, as well as biographies. And I selected a book from my segment that was related to Ireland because I pictured so many of these young men that were students at St. Ignatius were Irish immigrants or sons of Irish immigrants. And I thought they probably would be interested in reading something about their own history in Ireland. I found myself, after looking at a few different volumes, I kept finding myself being drawn back to John Patrick Prendergast's Cromwellian Settlement of Ireland, although I was really reluctant at first to read it because I'm pretty squeamish and just had this imagination. But anyhow, I finally approached it, read Prendergast's preface, and decided that was my book. In his preface, he described how he conducted his research, and that's what really kind of pulled me in. He had to be very persistent. He just was determined to find that there had to be documents left over from, 2 centuries before. And finally, he was able, through his great detective work and creativity, to find a mother lode of documents of original source materials, a huge find in the Tower of Dublin Castle. And some of these were really, they were really significant. Some were petitions for dispensation from transportation in Connaught, and there was domestic correspondence, the down survey of land where they divided the land up and surveyed it before they assigned it, and so on, and Cromwell's Court of Claims records. The, I wasn't as familiar with this whole settlement, but the whole purpose was really land. Land was to be used to repay the military for wages that were in arrears. And it was also to be given to English investors who were called adventurers. What a name. But the reality was, or the actual effect was, a lot of the rules and the penalties were anti-Catholic and anti-Irish. You can see what happened, the green are the Irish before the settlement, and you can see where they're all sequestered in one single province. Prendergast summarized his book in this way. The captains and men of war of the Irish, amounting to 40,000 men and upwards, they banished to Spain, where they took service under that king. Others of them, with a crowd of orphan boys and girls, were transported to serve the English planters in West Indies. And the remnant of the nation, not banished or transported, were to be transplanted into Connaught, while the conquering army dividing the ancient inheritances of the Irish amongst them by lot. Prendergast used letters, petitions, land surveys, and other records to tell this story. In the text itself, as well as in footnotes and different appendices, and the facts emerged, like what we see. But Prendergast didn't, and so you can see 5/6 of the population of Ireland died as a result of starvation, plague, execution, and other effects of the transplantation. But Prendergast didn't just present facts. He included stories, and he quoted the petitions. He offered a really vivid image of starvation, and so on. He named individual victims. He told their stories. He gave them faces. And thus his writing also looked like this. Here's one of the petitions for a man that had died, and his petitioners, his survivors, his children, they were pleading for some type of relief, some money from his estate. Here's another person who is again begging for help to get her cattle back from Connaught. Mary Archer pleading for her father. Perhaps the saddest of all, Daniel Connery, who was sentenced because he was sentenced to be banished because he had helped a priest. And his wife died. He had 12 children. 3 of his daughters were transported to the West Indies. So you saw this truly human story. And I couldn't help but thinking about those students at St. Ignatius. How did they receive this book when they read it? Now, we all know that the Irish have this long tradition of an oral method of transmitting their history through stories, through poems, through songs, special family legends. So while the settlements took place 2 centuries before they would have read this book, it was first published in 1865, our edition was 1868, these students still would have had this image of Cromwell as a bogeyman. You say the word Cromwell today, and you still have that gut reaction that I had in selecting the book. In fact, he is still memorialized in songs being written today. You heard of the Irish group, the Pogues? They have a song out about Cromwell. So would the students, what would they have thought when they read this book? Perhaps as a child, they read the nursery rhyme, Brother Tig. So, "Ho, Brother Tig, what is your story? I went to the woods and shot a Tory." Well, after reading Prendergast, they would have now realized a Tory was not a member of the British Parliament. A Tory was actually a revolutionary who had escaped banishment and was operating as an outlaw with a price on his head. It makes the poem a lot more, and this was a nursery rhyme. Would they have put the poem, or similar poems, or stories, or songs into historic perspective after reading Prendergast? Perhaps the students would have recognized family names either in the course of reading the context of the book or the index of names. They might have combed these indices looking for family names and trying to map them with family legends. Or they might have, whoops, went backwards. They might have checked out the list of the military who got land. Or perhaps they looked at the adventurers listed here, looking for family names. I did. So what was their reaction if they found somebody? I went on and thought of other questions. Here they had these whole group of children, thousands of children and women, men, and then some men, all being sold as slaves. And the Civil War had just ended. Did they draw any kind of comparisons between the fact that there were Irish slaves and African slaves, and what were the differences? Did they have a different outlook towards slavery? Did they see any parallels between the idea of resettlement of all of these Irish to one province and resettlement of the Native American tribes from Chicago and elsewhere that had happened, 20, 30 years before and was still going on? Did they see any comparisons there? We know that the Irish nationalists were very active in America at this time and in Chicago. We had the Irish Republican Brotherhood, we had Clan na Gael, we had several others. And what would be the effect of reading this book on this age group that is often idealistic? I know what I was like when I was about that age, and we had the time of the Troubles and singing the songs, including Men Behind the Wire, where we heard Cromwell's Men Were Here Again. I know what that effect had on all of us. What effect did it have on these young men? And how did the non-Irish foreign-born Jesuits, how would they have countered this? How would they have steered this in a more positive fashion? The inclusion of Prendergast group, and I kept misspelling it, I must say, in the St. Ignatius College Library shows that the Jesuits were not afraid to expose their students to this kind of knowledge. This book obviously was well read by students over the next 140 years or so, as it's in very, very, very bad shape. And it's really ready for a well-earned retirement, but after the exhibit. However, despite its age, it's still considered one of the more important works on this whole topic. It's still being published today. And in fact, its most recent edition, and I'm using the word edition because it is a new edition, not a reprint, was just published in London in 1996. Thank you.
I've been authorized to make a prepared statement. My selected book's title is Digest of the Published Opinions of the Attorneys General and of the Leading Decisions of the Federal Courts with reference to international law, treaties, and kindred subjects. This book holds a curious place in the St. Ignatius Library. The index calls it Legislation, Secular, Neighbor to Theology, and Mental Philosophy. The digest bulleted legal interpretations of the past Attorney Generals, collated with Attorney General Caldwater, are shelved near a copy of the U.S. Constitution, the Maryland Charter granted by their Majesties King William and Queen Mary to the inhabitants of the province of the Massachusetts Bay, with notes on law set by England from 1692 to 1732, and the Magna Carta. It's all the more interesting, this book found its home alongside so many historically significant documents for its authorship. John Lambert Caldwater was an Assistant Secretary of State from 1874 to 1877, and one-time president of the New York City Bar Association, indicating he knew international law intimately. In 1792, he became a founding partner in Cadwallader, Wickersham, and Taft, one of the oldest continuously operating law firms in the United States. Incidentally, Wickersham would go on to serve as Attorney General under Taft, brother to Taft in the law firm. He was also the elected president of the New York Public Library, and successfully consolidated 3 constituent foundations into a central library. He was not a king, he was not a framer of the Constitution, and probably not one of the barons who drafted the Magna Carta. He was the 10th Assistant Secretary of State of the United States, and aware of international law. But this title is not an official and anonymous publication by a church, though my section has many of those. It is printed by the Government Printing Office in 1877. This puts him in the curious position of being a named author published as an official voice by the United States government to clearly explain the government's position, but not folded under as anonymous in the official ledger. More importantly, this is a digest, not a single monolithic text like the Constitution or the Magna Carta as presented in the library. The closest approximation to the library may have been Code Civil de la République Française, which I'm awful at French, I'm sorry, by an anonymous author. Maybe Loyola found it important to have a distillation of law in France and America. Unfortunately, this comparison cannot be direct. Our original ledger does not indicate a date, author, or publication for Code Civil. In my section, it's lost, and the title too vague to find a nearest neighbor match. Similarly, other titles that would have addressed American law, including Every Man His Own Lawyer, A Working Man's Guide to American Law, is also lost. It was shipped to the law library roughly 30 years ago and has mysteriously disappeared. It is possible that the Civil Code and Every Man His Own Lawyer would have better reflected domestic policy in France and America respectively, while Digest addresses America's foreign policy. I can speak to the content of the Digest. The text only addresses international law as the United States would have applied it circa 1877, and even then it is terse. The then current understanding of a treaty or law, whether it applied to a citizen, resident alien, or boat on the high seas, is clipped into bullet points with remarks for the most salient court case or direct published opinion of a standing or previous attorney general. For example, where a gun is fired from an American vessel in the harbor of a foreign port, killing a person on a vessel belonging to the natives of the country, held that the offense was committed on board the foreign vessel where the shot took place. Essentially, they cannot be tried in American court for a crime as America would consider it. They'd have to be taken into that court instead. My research suggests that this brevity of language was typical of Cadwallader and even celebrated when the Trenton, New Jersey Public Library was opened in April 6, 1915, roughly 1 year after his death in March of 1914. The appreciation speech had this to say: Mr. Cadwallader was one of the old type of lawyers who assisted their clients to a wise solution of their difficulties, or, if a contest was inevitable, delighted to strive mightily for the protection of their rights. His ability to summarize and state to a court in terse and incisive phrase the substance of a controversy was surpassed by few, if any, lawyers of his time, while his instinctive sense of justice gave him grasp of principle which made him less prone than most men to a reliance upon codeless myriad of precedents. No lawyer could more readily divest himself of the encumbrance of technicalities and penetrate to the heart of the situation. So, why did something so contemporary find its place among such seminal political documents? The Digest's inclusion of standing good law, in contrast with repealed law, offers both a history and a complete current edition of the U.S.'s interpretation of international law and its application on foreign subjects in the United States. The text's clear declaration on nationality and alien status may have served as a guide for those crossing and dwelling in America, including St. Ignatius as a campus body. Anyone unfamiliar with America's application of international law could use it as a terse guide. This might include students tasked with comparing and contrasting English law with current American law, or perhaps comparing and contrasting the law of the land at the federal level with those delineated in the Maryland Charter text. After all, there must be quite a difference between 1877 and 1732. If anything, the catalog entry and consideration leads to further questions of St. Ignatius and Loyola's history. Is it possible this was included explicitly as a pre-law course in Ignatius' early days? Did a student draw on this text when taking a bar exam or as part of a thesis? How many foreign board students or faculty were at St. Ignatius when this catalog was likely composed? That's to say, how many may have used the text to a wise solution of their difficulties personally when exploring citizenship and their rights as foreign aliens? To that matter, how did the local Jesuit community respond to Caldewater's declaration on page 5 that aliens domiciled in the United States owe a local and temporary allegiance to the government of the United States? There's plenty of book history this book calls to question, but the best we have in hand is the letter of the law, which in this case is the opinion and composition of several attorneys general and John Lambert Caldewater. I hope it brings interesting questions for Loyola's book history for years to come.
Excellent work. Any questions? I realize it's 9:29.
Because my question, first you can ask it in front of everyone.
It's for both of you, actually. I mean, I don't mean this in a critical way or to like put you on the spot because it might be impossible to answer, but you both talked a lot about like how would students react to this? Like how do they engage with this material? I'm just wondering if you hope to address that in your papers, like how you would start to think about answering those questions. I don't know if that's answered.
Probably just gonna ask the same question in my paper.
Conclude on one would wonder.
I personally am, I know the difficulty it takes to judge reception, especially when it comes to books or any sort of history or anything. So you can only assume and use, I mean, I don't think there will, I'll be able, it's the only book I've found that Hoban like has any relation to. I haven't seen any reviews about it in the research that I've done, and that would be the only sort of reception I think I could gauge off of this itself. From the student's perspective, it, like we've discussed in class, many of them didn't even stay through finishing. So who knows how many hands actually did touch this book. I'm actually incredibly impressed that it's still in the stacks today.
You know, in response to mine, I did an answer to the first question, the two questions I asked. I don't know how I would find that, but an answer to the third question, it would be to look at some of the nationalist groups of the time. There was actually an invasion of Canada, strike over Ireland in 1870. It had followed one that was in 1862 or something, or 1865. So are there any lists of those people that were arrested after that or whatever? And tried to look at some of the other nationalist activity, the Land League. There are records, and I'm sure Ellen has got lots of advice on that too.
No, my only thing for Maureen and Kim would be that perhaps it had to do with the faculty becoming more Irish. This is the kind of book, maybe it wasn't meant for the students at all, but it's a signal of how the faculty was changing. And you know, you have honest John Comiskey, who's one of the most famous Fenians, the father of Charles Comiskey, White Sox fame. It was a huge deal in Holy Family Parish, so I think those two books would have had a great reception, but perhaps at the faculty level, not the students.
Yeah, I think it would be, again, kind of dangerous at that age. More dangerous than Darwin, probably, possibly. But anyhow, I think it would be. I'm sure that some of them got into their hands, but who knows? But again, that's what I would do, is I'd try to look to see any, that people, that if there are alumni lists even, you know, to see, do any of those appear on other groups?
I have a question for Adam, because I feel bad for him. And maybe you mentioned this, but what section was this? What's your section?
Oh, my section is, if I'm remembering this correctly, theology, natural philosophy. No, not natural philosophy. I'm very sorry. I'm getting discombobulated. No, it's theology. I'm sorry. I actually had this pulled up as a note. It's been a long time. Sorry. It is definitely 9:30. I hate to say it, it's past my bedtime.
But you have legislation.
Actually, I have legislation, theology, and mental philosophy. So this is sandwiched in between all three.
Nailed it.
Yeah. Oh.
So what curriculum would this be? Would this be, was it a science curriculum? Do you know?
I really don't know. I've been trying to find curriculum for a separate project, and it's exceedingly difficult before 1954. So this is interesting.
I think one of the interesting things that's going on in 19th century libraries in general is the deposit of government documents. And I guess one of the interesting questions I would have for you, I think many of us have probably worked from the assumption of intentionality, right? That the books that are here because somebody chose, a librarian chose, a faculty member chose for them to be here. It is a pretty story, that I guess. But I'm curious, Adam, what you've seen, the sort of promiscuous mingling of all of these different types of texts, if you think that if you were to be able to locate the original copies, if you wouldn't be surprised to see that these were books given, randomly given, that the Jesuits were too polite to read at night, as Katya has given us the image of. Do you think there's something dangerous in overreading the intentionality?
I'm not really certain that you can be overreading intentionality, since this is a university in all of its incarnations that was trying to make a home more dwelling than crossing in Chicago, released after some time. So it'd be awfully strange to not include non-ecclesiastical law dealing specifically with the United States and domestic and foreign policy. At least in this particular segment, I think the dumbest and probably the best way to think of the intent is you've got to have it, or else suddenly you've got nothing but Roman and French texts for American students, ones who might want to go on to become lawyers.
And it is within the generation that we will have the beginning of the law school at Loyola and other professional school, and there's a drive towards professionalization at the end of the 19th century. So, that it may well be that they're looking ahead to that type of education.